have the right to be who we want to be, and we also have the right for freedom.
Express yourself, don't stress.
Don't see what's to discover on the other side. There's borders around countries, borders around the skies. The only border close you in is the border around your mind. We bring to the U.S. Social Forum those who are women, two-spirited, trans, lesbians, gay men, intersex, bisexual, queer, gender nonconforming, and questioning. We honor those just named who have been leaders in every struggle for justice and liberation, often unnamed and unrecognized. And we lift up our voices for those who have been raped, beaten, killed in war-torn lands, at the borders of this country, in sex trafficking and slavery, in the streets and in our homes, throughout the world. We lift up our voices for all of us whose bodies have been colonized and exploited for labor, sex, pleasure, money, and war. Tonight, we ask questions. Why does the right deliberately choose gender oppression as the fast-track strategy to ensuring domination? Why did the right create a religious arm that would focus on reproductive rights, sexuality, and family, and that it would connect those to the idea of patriotism? And why does the left, without declaring it a strategy, quietly use gender discrimination to collude in creating a hierarchical dominance? We ask you to consider the question of what is central to the struggle for self-determination and self-defense throughout the world. And we ask you to consider what stands at the center as a model for domination and violence. We say there will be no end to war as long as there is systemic and personal violence against women, queers, and children. Because this is a basic inspirational model for violence worldwide. We say there is no chance for justice to be gained as long as women and children are considered secondary, objects for ownership, and less than human. This is a foundational model for inequality and injustice. We say that racism will not be eliminated unless at the same time sexism is eliminated, because they are inextricably connected and linked together. We ask you tonight to consider broadly the role of gender liberation in the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality through our bodies, our spirits, our lives, our communities, and the world. We have 5 speakers tonight, and the first is Andrea Smith, known to many of us as Andy Smith. Andy is the co-founder of Insight, Women of Color Against Violence. She is the co-founder of the Boarding School Healing Project. She is the editor of The Revolution Will Not Be Funded Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. And she is the author of Conquest, Sexual Violence and American Genocide. She is also co-editor of the Color Violence, the Insight anthology. Get your hands on that, all of those books, but know this, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded is sold out. And you can order it at the Left Turn table and Insight table at this conference. So, Andy.
In particular, how does the heteropatriarchal family serve as the building block of empire? Now, to understand this question, we can now turn to the Christian right who will explain it to us. This is from Charles Colson, who explains why the cause of terrorism is same-sex marriage. Quote, "Marriage is the traditional building block of human society, intended to unite couples and bring children into the world. There is a natural moral order of the family. Marriage is not a private institution designed solely for the individual gratification of its participants. If we fail to enact a federal marriage amendment, we can expect not just more family breakdown, but more criminals behind bars and more chaos in the street. It's like handing moral weapons of mass destruction to those who would use America's decadence to recruit more snipers and hijackers and suicide bombers. We must preserve traditional marriage in order to protect the United States from those who would use our depravity to destroy us." And World Magazine, which is a Christian right magazine, further explains that the cause of the Abu Ghraib crisis was feminism. Because feminism causes women to become disoriented about their gender roles, join the army, and abuse prisoners. See, that's what I told you about. Okay, I'll try to slow down. Okay. So the assumption then behind this analysis is that heteropatriarchy is fundamental to empire because patriarchy is what naturalizes social hierarchy. That is, just as men are supposed to naturally rule over women, so too should the elites of a society naturally rule everyone else. This is why in the history of Indian genocide, the first task that colonizers took on was to integrate patriarchy into native communities, because they knew that we would not accept colonial domination until native men started treating native women the way white men treat white women. In addition, the primary tool used by colonists is sexual violence. When we look at the history of Indian massacres, it's not just that colonists tried to kill native people, but these massacres are always accompanied with sexual mutilation, rape, etc. Because the goal is not just to kill native people, but to kill our sense of even being a people. So what sexual violence does for colonialism and white supremacy is render women of color inherently rapeable, our lands inherently invadable, and our resources inherently extractable. Unfortunately, however, the response to the heteropatriarchal Christian America in our social justice movements is often an equally heteropatriarchal social justice struggle. And there are many ways I see this impacting our movements, but I will just name a few that go beyond simply just the status of women or LGBT communities. First of all, we have such an ingrained idea that social hierarchy is natural that we replicate this in our own movements, whether it is the neo-colonial middle managers of the nonprofit industrial complex or the revolutionary vanguard elite. The idea is that we need patriarchs of any gender to manage and police the revolutionary family. This sense of natural social hierarchy then impacts what kind of revolutionary imagination we can even come up with. First of all, let's just look at the slogan of the U.S. Social Forum. Another world is possible, but another U.S. is necessary. But the question to put on the table is, if another world is possible, is the U.S. itself necessary? Gentler, settler colonial state that's based on slavery and genocide. And then finally, I want to mention another aspect of this gender dynamic in which we kind of have a private-public split in our work. That is, when we think of the work of the revolution, we think of going out in the streets, protesting, etc. And there we're supposed to be total revolutionary badasses, and if we got a problem, we're supposed to go home and deal with it. Of course, we don't have our acts together, so we come and screw up the movements, but we have no place to actually deal with it in a public way. Finally, when we think of the work of the revolution, we do collective work in the public sphere, but we don't collectivize the child care, we don't collectivize our income sharing, we don't collectivize feeding ourselves. So we build a movement that's not accessible to most people. Yeah. And then finally, because we don't have a sufficient intersectional analysis about race and gender, we end up with groups supporting all sorts of bizarre platforms that are completely counterproductive. Just to name a few of hundreds, we have the mainstream anti-violence movement saying the solution to domestic violence is to rely on the prison industrial complex and the police, and saying we should support bombing Afghanistan because it will liberate women from the Taliban, because bombing women liberates them. And again, the assumption is let's turn over women from the patriarchal family to the patriarchal state. Meanwhile, we have social justice movements organizing around state violence, but won't address violence going on against women in their own organizations. That is seen as a private issue, and we're not, again, looking at how colonialism and white supremacy can only happen through gender violence. And then finally, we have environmental groups and some pro-choice groups supporting population control policies and dangerous contraceptives in communities of color, because rather than target the state or corporations for environmental destruction or poverty, they enlist the state and corporations to target women of color and police their ability to reproduce. So, in conclusion, an inadequate gender analysis doesn't just negatively impact women, it impacts all our struggles for social justice. If we are not serious about dismantling heteropatriarchy, then we are not serious about dismantling white supremacy or colonialism, and we might as well go home and tell the Christian right to retire because we are doing their job for them. Thank you.
I feel like I have the best job in the movement tonight. Our next speaker is Mingus. Now, Mingus works in Atlanta, Georgia with Georgians for Choice, the statewide coalition for women's freedom. She believes that reproductive justice is crucial in the struggle for social change and the fight to end oppression. As a queer, disabled, Korean adoptee, she recognizes the urgency and barriers for oppressed communities to work together and build alliances for social change. Though her activism changes and evolves, her roots remain firmly planted in ending violence. Mia.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for inviting me to speak. I am honored to be sitting in front of you today. I am here today to talk about queerness and disability on the Gender and Sexuality Plenary, because my body was colonized by the medical industrial complex at the age of 6 months old. Because claiming my sexuality for myself as a woman of color, an API woman, a disabled woman, is part of my daily life. Because it has been assumed that my sexuality did not exist or should not exist because of my disability. Because I believe that disability and queerness and ableism, heterosexism, and homophobia are deeply connected and have many, many similarities. Because I only saw a handful of workshops dedicated to disability in the 960 plus offered this week. Because even as a disabled child, I knew my gender did not fit into the traditional box of woman because I was not able-bodied. And most importantly, because I have been stared at this past week at the U.S. Social Forum more times and more openly than I can remember in recent memory. As a queer disabled woman of color belonging to queer communities, I am here to say that my queerness does not carry any less importance than my race or my disability. It is not a Western or white disease and has everything to do with my activism. We are everywhere in all social justice and human rights movements, and we have always been here. As a queer disabled woman of color belonging to disabled communities, I am here to say that my disability is not a flaw, burden, something to be cured, or undesirable. It is not the cause of my queerness and has everything to do with my activism. I am a visibly disabled person, physically disabled, working in the reproductive justice, queer, women's, and social justice movements. As queer women of color, we know how white supremacy, male supremacy, and heterosexism get used together to render us invisible. We have a long history of having our sexuality controlled by the state, our communities, our families, and our partners. We know that our children are taken, no, stolen from us, left to fend for themselves in the foster care system, or given to middle to upper class white parents so that they may have a quote-unquote good home. We are forcibly and knowingly sterilized and given harmful birth control options in an attempt to respond to and control our sexualities. And let me be clear, this is about controlling our communities through women's sexuality and our bodies. We cannot allow ourselves to be divided and conquered. We know that our liberation is inextricably tied up with that of other women of color, our queer family, as well as other social justice movements. I want to take this opportunity to talk about something that I have not heard a lot about this past week, that is disability. My people who walk, sign, limp, self-medicate, roll, skip, push, and move through an ableist society where our issues and our bodies are seen as unimportant, burdensome, and get pushed out, ignored, and forgotten. I am tired of ableism not being included in our analysis of oppression and in our conversations on social justice. Ableism cuts across all of our movements because ableism dictates how bodies should function against a mythical able-bodied standard of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, economic exploitation, moral and religious beliefs, age. Ableism set the stage for queer people to be institutionalized as mentally disabled, for communities of color to be understood as less capable, less smart, and less intelligent, therefore naturally fit for slave labor. It set the stage for women to be used as wombs to reproduce children when, where, and how men needed them to. For women, for people with disabilities to be seen as disposable in a capitalistic and exploitative culture because they were not seen as productive. For immigrants to be seen and thought of as a disease that we must cure because it is weakening our country. For violence, cycles of poverty, lack of resources, and war to be used as a systematic tool to construct disability in communities and whole countries at large. Am I going too fast? As a disabled child, my body was literally invaded by the medical industrial complex, and for 18 plus years, white male doctors tried to fix the way I walked and looked, forever changing the way I felt about my own body, science, white supremacy, male supremacy, and ableism. When we talk about access to healthcare, ableism reminds us that we need to not only have the right to receive care, but also the right to refuse it. Like those of us belonging to the queer community, we know firsthand what it is like to be a spectacle in public and in private. We are stared at, gawked at, and harassed, whether it is strangers straining to watch the extraordinary way I walk and hurl my body through space, a powerful dance of defiance. I am claiming the different ways of moving through the world as valuable, sexy, and fabulous. It may also be spectators straining to figure if someone is a man or a woman, or staring in disdain at two women holding hands. The message is clear. We are different, strange, awkward, other. I say hallelujah. Because we are on the front lines of disability and queer politics every day, defining our bodies for ourselves. We are the ones resisting against the colonized default norm and choosing to construct our abilities, genders, sexualities, and relationships intentionally and in ways that help to create the kind of world we would like to see. We are the ones questioning models of relationships and loving that are rooted in the ownership of other people and their bodies. Because we know that the ways in which our bodies are commodified, owned, and colonized by the state, the medical industrial complex, science, and systems of oppression are connected to the ways in which our bodies are owned and controlled by our intimate relationships in our communities, families, friendships, and partnerships. That our fight for our bodies is connected to the fight for our land, food, and spirit. Another world is possible. We, the people in this room, can be, and we must be, the trailblazers for the movement, actively combating homophobia, ableism, and heterosexism, standing up as strong allies for queer and disabled folks, saying no to campaigns and policies that argue for the rights of some over the rights of others. But I want us to go farther. I want us to begin to see queerness as a tool for liberation. In the same way that each of our unique movements show us another facet of social justice, queerness in all its glory and richness exposes the opportunity to allow us to define and claim who we love, how we love, and our ability to love. I believe that the power to challenge and change the way we love is strong enough to transform our movements. We can deconstruct patriarchal ways of loving one another, the traditional heterosexist family model, monogamy, and revel in the privilege to imagine more. The vast diversity of disability affords us the chance to define and claim our bodies in a long spectrum of abilities encompassing the way we look, move, think, communicate, feel, and function. There is not only one way to be in the world. As a people, we have much to teach and give. I believe that we can understand disability as a powerful way to exist in the world, changing how we value our bodies, how we do the work, and how we truly create accessibility. We need to incorporate a radical critique and awareness of ableism, heterosexism, and able-bodied heteronormativity into our movements. We must ensure that queer and disabled people with these radical critiques, right, are included in our work and organizing. We must examine the ways in which heterosexism and ableism are inextricably linked to white supremacy, capitalism, and our culture's current practice of science, medicine, and health. That one of the reasons that queer people are seen as less than is because we do not fit one of the main criteria to be able-bodied, the ability to reproduce. We need to talk about our relationship to sex and people in ways that challenge ownership and entitlement. But most importantly, we must commit to examining ableism and heterosexism in our own lives and our own privilege. We must listen to our loved ones who identify as queer and disabled. I believe another world is possible. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Loretta Ross. Loretta is the national coordinator of the sister song Women of Color Reproductive Health Collective, and served as national co-director of the 2004 March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C., the largest protest march in U.S. history. As part of a 30-year history in social justice activism, Loretta founded and directed the National Center for Human Rights Education in Atlanta, which has affected all of our lives. She has authored several pieces on reproductive justice, is a women's studies graduate of Agnes Scott College.
In 2007,
Can we just say, yay, women's colleges? And holds an honorary doctorate of civil law from Arcadia University. She has also served on human rights tribunals and is the coordinator of the Women's Working Group for this USSF, and was one of the people who fought to make possible this plenary tonight. Loretta.
thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say to my Sister Song Posse members, how y'all doing? Sister Songs in the house. I am, first of all, have to say how proud I am of the speakers who have come before me, because we needed that analysis that these young minds are producing. I'm not hearing the best analysis coming from the people with the gray hair, you know, so it was righteous, and thank you, Andy, thank you, Mia. I'm actually gonna flip the script a little bit, because I knew that Andy and Mia were gonna talk about the colonization process and the colonization of bodies, and so I'm gonna focus my remarks on the colonization of our minds. Because nobody can make a slave of you without your permission. Now, earlier today in the Feminism and Race and Class workshop, a young high school student asked the panel to define feminism. And I didn't answer them, but I'm gonna talk about it now. Because right now, we have too many women busting our asses to fight for your rights while you won't use the F word. And I'm a little sick of it. That's the colonized mind speaking. Feminism is about power. And it's about the power to control your own life and your own body and to resist what Andy calls heteropatriarchy. If you agree with that, then you're a feminist. Feminism is about the power to question what gender, race, and class means to you, and to decide if and when or whether you want to fit into those boxes other people have prepared for you. Feminism is the resisting of the colonizing of your mind, even as they colonize our bodies, our families, and our communities. Because feminism is the resisting of the exploitation of our labor, our reproduction, and our sex. And before I go on, let me say, feminism is about the right to have a healthy sex and sexuality. We're the ones that talk about sex. We have always been the ones to talk about sex. And anybody having sex needs to be a feminist. As one of the heterosexual women up here on the stage, my boyfriend, when I started dating him 10 years ago, once asked me, why am I a feminist? And I looked him straight in the eye and I told him, because I want better men. Let's be clear. Feminism is the right to have a baby, but understanding that you don't have to have a baby to be a woman. And we don't lose our human rights when we become pregnant. So feminism is not only opposing sexism, homophobia, but it fights all forms of white supremacy and all the forms of injustice that grow from that evil seed. So, having said all of that, I'm probably going to piss you off. The people who know me well know that I'm good at pissing people off. Because rather than talk about what our enemies are doing to us, I'm going to talk about instead what we do to ourselves. Because we can't build a human rights movement without stopping some of our dangerous eating of ourselves. And I'm not talking in a pleasurable, sexist way. At the Katrina Plenary, were y'all here for that Katrina Plenary? Didn't it rock? We heard the Latinas talking about needing to bring together the old slaves with the new slaves. I thought that was a wonderful vision that they offered. But I want to also say there's a lot of old slave, new slave combinations out here. It's not just brown and black, but it's old and young, it's able and disabled, it's queer and straight, it's native born and immigrant. There's a lot of old slave, new slave combinations that need to get over themselves. So I'm going to take some elder privilege. I take elder privilege because I'm proud to be an elder. I entered this movement when I was 15, you know? And the fact that I've survived more than 35 years in this process without being assassinated says something. So I want to talk to you about some old slave stuff that we need to pass on, particularly as an African-American woman, because there's this African proverb out here. A new broom sweeps real well, but the old broom knows the corners. And you have to have both. The first I want to pass on is you need to beware of feeling special or privileged simply because you're oppressed. Everybody is oppressed. Feeling like your oppression is special leads to competitive victimhood, where you try to put somebody else down so that you can lift yourself up. What we have to understand is that while we're all oppressed, those of us who are sitting here in the U.S. social forum, our privilege is that we've understood that when they screw you, the only way to enjoy it is to screw them back. Secondly, we need to beware of divide and conquer politics. Don't get so busy criticizing everybody else's work that you forget to do some of your own. And I see a lot of that in the movement. People perfecting their knives on the people accessible to them versus the real enemy that we all have out here. And understanding that intersectionality, just because you learn the word doesn't mean it was created the day you learned it. This is a concept that has been offered by women of color since our beginning of struggling against colonization and oppression in this country. Thirdly, this is some more old slave stuff. Beware of Uncle Toms, and you know who you are. Because there's people who look like you in the same situation that you are who will sell you out for a used condom. Like my mother used to say, they might be your color, but that doesn't make them your kind. And you need to be clear not to become one of them. Beware of those who feel that their liberation depends on silencing you and making you invisible. We have had these tensions among women of color and white women, among women and queer folks. All of this stuff is about fighting for equal opportunity to oppress, not liberating us all from oppression. And you need to understand the difference. We need to be clear that we don't blame each other for how white supremacy operates. We didn't construct this system, nor do we maintain it. And this is bullshit. I mean, I'm sorry, but as an African-American woman who has had more stuff dealt to her than all the stuff dealt to her, basically, that America can deal out, I don't need to be called responsible for your pain. The best I can do is work with you so that none of us are hurting. Let's be clear. This is where I'm gonna really get in trouble. Because there somehow is this belief out here that somehow we're gonna deconstruct white supremacy without dealing with anti-black racism against black people. That ain't gonna work. Let's be clear that white supremacy would gladly substitute anybody they can find rather than deal with that fundamental relationship of slavery and colonization of Native American and African American people. They'd be more than happy to talk to anybody else but us. Don't dump on me because I'm accessible and will listen. Because that means you can't tell a friend from an enemy. Instead of bringing me your anger, bring me your righteous outrage at all injustices, and we'll work together to end our collective pain. And the last thing I'll say is let's understand what leadership is. Old slaves, new slaves. Leadership is not a throne. Leadership isn't everybody paying homage to you and telling you over and over how damn fine and great you are. Leadership is an opportunity to serve to the best of your ability. Leadership is willingness to step out there and take risks and make mistakes and be accountable for those mistakes. I'm tired of folks telling me and others like me or anybody else, you need to give me some leadership like it's a Christmas gift. Leadership is earned, and you don't get it just because of anything. Do y'all remember that last poet's song, Just Because You're Black? It's glorious to die for a cause, but it's a tragedy to die just because you're black. Well, you don't become a leader just because you're anything. You're a leader because you are willing to lay down and let people walk over you to get to their freedom. So, in conclusion, if we old slaves and we new slaves come together, we can build a new movement in this country called human rights. I believe we can do that, but to do that, the first thing we have to remember is that a slave cannot own a slave. Thank you.
Loretta Ross. Our next speaker is Imani Henry. Imani Henry is a staff organizer with the International Action Center. For the last 14 years, he has worked on building coalitions with communities of color and LGBT movements to fight within broad social justice campaigns. He is also the former program coordinator of Trans Justice, New York City's first organization by and for trans and gender non-conforming people, which is a project of our beloved Audre Lorde project.
Very grateful to be asked to be on the panel again as the only male speaker. I also want to take a moment, in particular because of the development around many Cubans who wanted to be here, who were denied visas to be here, to recognize Roberto Gonzalez, who is here, and who is the brother of Rene Gonzalez, one of the Cuban Five. How many folks know about the Cuban Five? These are 5 innocent men who are being held as political prisoners and prisoners of war by the US government. We must do everything we can to free the Cuban Five. They are freedom fighters who are trying to prevent violence against their people, and we must continue to point out who the real terrorists, who the real criminals in the world today, the US government. With that said, I actually want to take the time to talk about another case of political prisoners. And I really think it's important that we start to formalize that word, political prisoners, when we start talking about the Jersey Four. Because they too were railroaded by the US government, by the New York state government, for a crime they didn't commit, and were also given outrageous sentences. But what's important about the Jersey Four is that any one of us who face oppression because of who we are, people of color, women, lesbian, gay, bi, and trans, gender non-conforming people, young people, children, the physically challenged, elders, immigrants, any of us, could find ourselves behind bars like the Jersey Four. Just recently, on June 14th, 4 African-American women from Newark, New Jersey, Denise Brown, age 19, Jermaine Dandridge, 20, Patrice Johnson, 20, and Renita Hill, 24, received sentences ranging for 3.5 years to 11 years in prison. None of these women had previous criminal records. 2 of them are parents of small children. Their crime, defending themselves from a physical attack by a 29-year-old man who could not handle his sexual advancement being rejected. He spat in their face, ripped the hair out of one of their scalps. He held them down, he choked them, he threatened them with sexual assault, all because they were lesbians. This happened the summer of 2006, and 6 friends, again, all African-American lesbians from Newark, New Jersey, were walking in the West Village, which is the historic center of LGBT communities in New York. This is where Stonewall Rebellion happened. This is the location where the New York Pride Parade ends. For decades, this has been the home and a safe haven for working-class LGBT youth, especially of color. This brutal attack took place on their home turf. But the bottom line is about the gentrification of the West Village, where they're pushing out working-class communities, the LGBT community itself, and especially young people of color, both gay and straight, out of the village. That's what this is about. They deem this a so-called hate crime against a straight man. Every possible racist, anti-youth, misogynist, anti-LGBT tactic was used by the entire state apparatus and media to railroad these women. They used anti-youth laws that say no more than 5 people can congregate at a time. That constitutes, quote-unquote, a gang. Sounds like slavery laws, remember? No more than 3. They use anti-lesbian and racist terms, calling them, quote-unquote, a lesbian wolf pack, 7 angry lesbians, and senselessly use their genders. One butch lesbian, an AG, was reported in the New York Post as quote-unquote, growling like a dog. But in particular, 19-year-old Betita Johnson, one of the more feminine of the Jersey 7, 4'11", 95 pounds, went into her purse and took out a small steak knife in the hope of stopping this man from choking her friend. And she was considered the ringleader and got the highest sentence of 11 years. And no one died in this case. Actually, 2 young African-American men ran up to help these young women, and in the process, the attacker was stabbed and sent to the hospital. Now, there were never any tests done on Patrice's knife to show whether or not she even punctured this man's abdomen, but she was given 11 years. How many times do we as people of color, as women, as LGBT people, end up in the hospital after we are brutally attacked? And finally, here is a case where women fought back and their assailant ended up in the hospital. How many times in society do racist killer cops get off for murdering our community, our people of color, our youth? How many indictments are there of officials in ICE that raid our homes, that detain our people? None. And again, the Minutemen. Lou Dobbs can promote and put out the Minutemen out on national television, and they can openly organize in the US. But again, when we as oppressed people stand up and fight back, we are targeted, we're arrested, and we're jailed, we're shot at our marches. The Jersey 4 is one of the many messages that are telling us not to fight back. You better be meek and cower despite these attacks. Fierce, the LGBT political organization, youth organization of color in New York City. And again, I want to be clear about them. They are a political organization. And with all due respect to all of the youth programs that they foremost and see themselves as a political organization to organize young people to take back the village and make sure it stays the safe haven that it is. They have been at the forefront of the case of the Jersey 4. In fact, some of the families have even had to mortgage their homes to just pay for the legal fees. This verdict was devastating for us in New York. And who would think in 2002, in New York City, that the right to self-defense would be considered a crime? We need to know that the verdict was meant to demoralize not only the leadership of Fierce and the young people that are fighting to battle against the gentrification of the West Village, and we need to be clear that we cannot let that happen. We cannot let this struggle of the Jersey 4 fall on Fierce and other LGBT organizations in New York City. that we need to build a broad-based national solidarity movement to free these sisters, these political prisoners. And I want to say, and just to be clear, because I'm an organizer, and I know that all of us that are here today came with campaigns, with leaflets and pamphlets and everything to promote the work that we're doing back home. And I know that it has been very hard for us as organizers in this period of time. I want to just be clear that I think that more importantly, that one of the things that we're fighting right now is about demoralization in our movement. Take the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, It's gone on about almost 5 years. Congress has been complacent, continues to fund the war. Clearly, folks voted and said they want the war to end. We go to demonstration after demonstration, and still we feel like the war won't end. There's a whole generation who has lived through 2 terms of Bush and this endless war. And now the US wants to go after Iran and whoever else they want to go after, still occupying countries around Latin America and Africa and Asia. Some even feel excited about the 2008 elections because they believe that some president will do something about the war. At the same time, nothing in history has ever shown that a US presidential election has ever done anything about war or any of the social gains we have. What has been shown that everything we've won, including the right to vote itself, has been based on us, massed, in the streets, fighting. Just to be clear, this month, in September is coming up, every anti-war group has put out a demonstration coming up for September, or in the Bay Area. And I hope that all of us will think about where we can be this September to stop this war. Because we know that every single raid that we experience as immigrants, every loss of job, every social program, every anti-LGBT attack is a product of this capitalist system that needs to continue not only imperialist war, but trying to re-colonialize the rest of the world. Personally, what I think has been powerful about the USSF is that we have this amazing opportunity to continue to strengthen our movement at this very conference. It's about building more solidarity with each other. It's about the consensus that I think is true, and many people will say this, that we actually want to see a stronger left in this country, that we want to unite across our differences. And I think the key to solidarity, really truthfully, is just, like y'all are in this room, we came to this conference, it's about showing up. It's really simple. We can talk about coalition building, we can talk about, there's lots and lots to it. But when we just, in a nutshell, you just show up. You bring your banner. You endorse something. You sign on to the petition. You just show up. 2 nights ago, 2 trans women were almost arrested by the Atlanta police. They're organizers from New York City. All they did was go into a store and try and purchase something. And just because they were trans, the police were called. Now again, if the call went out, and around here at the USSF, I know that there are folks here that don't know what transgender means. Maybe this is the first time people have even seen transgender people. But I think what's important is that you may not have to have an analysis around transgender rights or understanding of transgender, but I do think that all of us feel strongly that we should defend trans people against the attack by the police. I may be a transgender man of color. I may be passionate about the Jersey 4, but I want to make it clear today, and I hope others will say the same, that I am in solidarity with every single struggle and fight that people have here that are represented in this auditorium. That I want to stand in solidarity with Power, that's fighting around gentrification and juvenile injustice in the Bay. I want to stand in solidarity with DARE, that is fighting around youth issues and community issues out in Providence, Rhode Island. I want to stand in solidarity with the folks fighting to return back to New Orleans and struggle around all the injustice because of Katrina and Rita. Because we know the greatest thing that can happen to the immigrant rights movement if more non-immigrants were stepping up and in the streets side by side with our sisters and brothers that are Muslim and Arab and South Asian and Caribbean. That's what we need.
This is known as a hard act to follow. Because these wonderful speakers have been so full of fire and inspiration and joy and everything else that I'm sitting here thinking, what the hell could I possibly add? I'll just add one little thing by way of explanation. The reason for that Nobel Peace Prize nomination was because in 101 years, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee has chosen a woman only twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. In 101 years, a woman only twice. So the idea was to kind of, make an example of that by saying, hey, there's a few others out there who could be nominated. But that was the purpose, to say women have been working for peace. Guess what? Haven't we all? Okay, right over there. So, anyway. And then I'm also thinking, with these serious ladies here, I've got to add something. I'm going to add a plug. Very embarrassing, but nevertheless. I have a new book coming out of the fall. It's called 500 Years of Chicana Women's History. Entonces, con 760 photographs. Oh my God. Bueno, ok. Mira, entonces buenas noches a todos. Estoy muy contenta de estar aquí con ustedes. When I first walked to the stage, I heard somebody talking Spanish. I thought, it's okay, I'm home. Bueno, gracias a todos. So, I guess I'm gonna be kind of nicey nice to start, leading up to baddie bad winning. I think the baddie bad's been done. But anyway, the nicey nice is that I think we really have, as women and queers and other forms of that oppression, we have made some progress. Okay, and I can say that because I'm old enough. In 1958, oh my God, I was an editor at the publishing house of Simon & Schuster, okay? And one day I asked for a raise, and you know what they said? You don't need a raise, you have a husband. Oh. Literally, this is a true story. And from there, things got a little bit better, but not much. And then some years later, the women's movement began in New York, where I was also living at the time. And I was really excited about it. There's a very small number of people in the New York Radical Women's Collective, very small number. This is like early 60s. And I went to the meetings. I was the only person of color there, but it was pretty exciting to be there and hear people talking about the problems. Well, one night we were meeting, and that was the night of the day that Martin Luther King was assassinated. So I went thinking, well, we're certainly going to say something about that. Nobody had a word to say about it. And that was a downer, folks, because I felt, here I am, a woman of color, and I mean, these folks don't care about it? And I'm mentioning this only as a down moment, which has since then been corrected a whole lot. But this was early 60s, and that's kind of where it was at the time. And a lot of women, a lot of Chicanas and other Latinas were not turned on by the women's movement of that time. And it was that time, because it was very middle class and very dominated by a certain set of values, like getting your husband to wash the dishes. Well, anyway, whatever. I'm making fun of something that should not be made fun of, and since then it's been a long struggle. But it was a moment, it was a revealing moment, and from that moment I'm leaping forward, a bunch of decades, because I can do that, huh? Today, you ask Latinas to call themselves feminists. What happens? See, everybody's very quiet. Okay. They're not so sure about that word. And they read it, and I guess I'm bringing up some problems here, huh? Okay. The reason is that it's very much associated with white women, white liberation, women's liberation. That's right. But the point is, these women are feminists by the way they think and act. They just may not use it. So I have a crusade going to make people say, soy feminista. to combat that a little bit. But it has been a bit of a problem, ¿verdad? And there's other things to be said about that particular experience that I want to mention here. I think that we need to see, in a particular situation of women of Latino women coming from Mexico, El Salvador, other countries in Latin America, what they face in the process of immigrating. It's a nasty business. If they don't get raped on the way, they come to the border. Those border agents, man, are they helpful if you just sort of give it a little bit. And there's always a possibility of that happening there at the border, and the coyotes will bring them in. And there's a whole exposure of Latino women to danger just coming here from another country where we won't say what's going on there. So I think we have to realize that women do face danger just in getting here. When they get here, whoa, what kinds of jobs do they get? Well, a lot of them are working as domestic workers, and if they have a male boss, you're lucky not to be asked to do certain things for that male boss if you're a domestic worker. And I know, I have friends, and I know what they're talking about in San Francisco. So there's all these situations facing immigrant Latino women just in the very moment, in the very experience of coming to this country and encountering the realities that are here, both economically, biologically, everything. And I think also the whole thing, the problem that we were talking about earlier about being disabled is also a problem, which I think there's not enough recognition, I think, in Latin America about the need of the disabled people for help. So I'm getting a lot of complicated, too complicated. But I do think that we've seen progress in these fronts. And for example, there was a time when in the Chicana movement, a movement of young Latinas, that you couldn't do security. That's for men, right? You couldn't make the speeches. Oh my, no, that's for men to do. Okay. You couldn't do the really heavy stuff. You could make the coffee. You could make the food. You could do you know what with the male leaders, and that was about it. That's changed, and I'm so happy to tell you that, for example, in San Francisco today, there are at least 2 organizations of Latinos, men and women both, who have adopted the principle that leadership in their organizations has to be 50-50 male and women. And that's a victory. It may sound like a small victory, and of course, do you think those guys are all cleaned up? No, they're not. But, I mean, they're not perfect, but they're trying. They're trying. They're also even combating some of the homophobic jokes that get made during marches and at rallies and things like that. And some of them are trying to stop that too, which is a big problem still. The homophobia is a problem. And I guess I'm just talking about problems. Anyway, I think that we have to be recognizing what we're into and what we're trying to change in the course of building our strength as people, and particularly as women. And I do believe we can do a whole lot better, certainly in the community that I'm working with. I'm very proud, however, to announce the good news of today to me is that a national organization of domestic workers has just been formed today. And I know a number of the organizations here at this social forum are supporting it, and I have enormous hopes for it. And I hope there are women here from Mujeres Unidas y Activas. There's 3. I hope you're out there somewhere, because there's 3 of you here, right? Dime sí o no. Sí. Mira, 1, 2, 3. La Mua se mueve. Anyway, this is one of the strongest organizations, I think, in the Bay Area of immigrant women who have been doing mostly domestic work, taking care of kids, cleaning, blah, 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 and fighting for their rights and not to be abused in any way, underpaid or paid for the wrong things. So this is a real victory. So I'm sort of trying to say, I think we're making some advances, and we have these questions to answer also. And I'm very excited about the movement that I see happening. Things that never happened before, believe me. Nothing like this was happening before. So it seems to me pretty clear by now, pretty clear by now, that there can be no successful, no effective organizing in the United States without the presence of women and queers in leadership positions. Particularly, obviously, about low-income women, women of color, and so forth, but they're there, and it's been interesting to see. This plenary here tonight, I think, was an accomplishment, a way of certain people making sure that we took a big hunk of time out to talk about women's issues, and that's what you have to do sometimes. Thank you. Oh, Loretta, I should say. Okay, I guess also one of Loretta was talking about the combating the brainwashing that goes on, the way we take on bad ideas in our own heads. I think that's very true, and I see that. That is why when you talk about the colonized body, we have to also talk about the colonized mind, and that's what I see so much among too many Latinas these days. So we've got to get rid of that one, and we also have to, I think, be developing a vision for the kind of society that we want. I don't mean just that it's free of sexism, free of racism. I mean a society that ain't capitalist. And ain't imperialist either. And is not running around the world thinking the way you establish leadership is by killing everybody. No. So, what are we going to call this society? Oh, this is where it gets tricky. Okay. Well, let me warn you. I went to Cuba in 1959, 3 months after the overthrow of Batista. A year later, Fidel Castro made a speech and said, "We're socialists. That's the way we're going." Okay. Well, they're still trying. They're still trying, and they're still there trying. And it's also that kind of move is happening all over Latin America. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador. And I think it's time for us to take on these models and start a little imitation and say, guess what? We are, Angela Davis says, I'm a communist with a small c. Think about it. The word communal is all there. We're talking about, aren't we, getting together, changing the world together with a lot of love, a lot of courage, and a lot of respect. And I feel so much of it right here in this room. Thank you all.
A little more. Open the window, let the dove fly. Now give it all you got. Open the window, let the dove fly. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.